Hey everyone, Dan here, and welcome to that Paintball channel. Today I want to begin something I'm very excited to do, and that's a multi-part review of a marker that, in my opinion and the opinion of a lot of people, is one of the greatest, most influential, most important markers of all time. Certainly in the mechanical realm, one of the top two markers ever produced. That is none other than... That's right. The AGD Airgun Designs Automag. Oh yes. Behold its glory, its beauty, its splendor, its magnificence. See what I did there? For 10 years, now think about that, a decade, 10 years from 1990 to 2000, this marker absolutely dominated on the tournament paintball field. Only the autococker had that kind of a claim to fame. Now, 10 years in paintball terms, that's an eternity. That's an earth age. If for no other reason than that, this marker would be worth talking about and sort of unpacking. But in addition to that, so much of what we have today in terms of technology, advancements, developments, are owed to this marker, to Airgun Designs, to Tom K, and just a lot of people don't know about this. And that is something that needs to be addressed, I think. Now, of course, you know, younger players, kids, new people, they're not going to know about that. You can't expect them to know about that. But I'm just always shocked and surprised by how many older players, you know, people who've been in it for a while, just don't know that much about Airgun Designs of the Automag. So I want to do, again, a multi-part series where we'll sort of break it up and just really talk about this marker and the innovations that came out of it, because it's just very impressive. So this first episode, I want to talk a little bit about the backstory, the history, the development of the marker. Next episode, we'll talk about some of the features and innovations that were done specifically. But to go back to the beginning, I think it's important to think about the mentality of what would become Airgun Designs. It's not Airgun Designs yet, but Tom K and his company, the sort of overarching way of thinking for them is one of problem solving. You come at a situation, you see what the issues are, and you figure out either a fix for it or you figure out a way to make the problem just not an issue anyway. You sidestep it, you just go in a completely different direction. And that was true in the way that they approached paintball. Now, to give some additional backstory in paintball in general, paintball is coming out of the cattle and the forestry services. So you'd have these pump-actuated pistols, they'd have a little 12-gram cartridge in the butt, and you'd have 10 rounds, and you'd use it to mark cattle and trees. Well, of course, it didn't take long for a couple of guys in the forestry service thought, got these pistols, got trees, got somebody to shoot at, let's do it. And, you know, a couple of guys screwing around on the job, and it turns into the sport. So at that time, pretty much everything is pump. Now, you had an exception in Tippmann. Tippmann came at it from a very different perspective. They came at it from the miniature firearms industry. They made miniature machine guns. So they used that technology in their approach to paintball markers. But everything else was pump. And so you've got Tom K and his company. They're coming at it at this from a very different perspective. You know, they had come from, you know, their background was pneumatic feed systems for the manufacturing industry. So just totally in a different direction. You know, a lot of these other companies, you know, who are doing the pumps, they're kind of coming out of the BB gun background, Daisy, for example. So, you know, manufacturing, that's a very different way. You know, you can imagine, you know, Tippmann firearms, that kind of makes sense with a paintball marker. But, you know, feed systems for the manufacturing industry is very strange. And, you know, Tom K and his company had done, I'll just use AGD just to make it simple. They had done some work with Sheridan PMI. They'd made a full face mask, and that, again, that's something that we can, you know, be thankful for. But they'd also done some work with the Sheridan valves, because there was a big rivalry between the Sheridan kind of systems and the Nelson-based systems. Nelson's were much more efficient. Sheridan's horribly efficient. So AGD went in there, they looked at the problem, they did a lot of research, a lot of development, and I mean, just, you know, they literally just went through point by point by point, trying to figure out why are these things so inefficient. Well, eventually they realized, okay, the hammers are too heavy, they're bouncing, they're letting air escape after the ball is long gone. But that way of thinking just shows how they attacked problems. You know, they went through in a very methodological manner, and they followed the evidence where it led them, and they were willing to just do experimentation and let the data drive the process. And that is something that is very admirable and just great. And so they began to look at the situation. Paintball, you know, all this, everything is pumped for the most part. You had the Tippmann, the SMG 60. It was effective, you know. Basically, it was a paintball machine gun, essentially. But it used clips, and it wasn't really gimmicky. I mean, it worked, but you're not really going to win tournaments with something like that. So basically, if you're playing tournament competitive ball, you're using a pump. So AGD looks at this and they say, why would anybody do that? You know, why would you use a pump when you could use semi-automatic? So they began to develop a blowback system, and they ultimately sold that to Daisy, who sat on it, thank goodness. They bought it back a year later, in 1988, I believe, and they began to do continued refinements. And eventually they said, look, there's a couple of problems here. And the first problem is just the blowback system itself, and the second is the propellant, which is CO2. The problem with blowback is that everything in that system is just overly complicated. It's clunky, it's junky, it's inelegant, it's just bleh. In a blowback system, if you're not familiar with this, take a look at a Tippmann 98. You basically have a hammer that's riding on a sear. You pull the trigger, the sear drops. The hammer is driven forward by a spring, hits a valve, the valve opens up, air splits two directions. One way pushes the ball, the other way pushes the bolt back. Well, it's a functional system, certainly, but it relies on the mass of, you know, the hammer that's coming forward, and it's just, there's so many parts that have to be in the system, and the parts in the system have to be really heavy duty to be able to deal with the shock loads. I mean, you think about this hammer that's being spring driven, it's being knocked open, and now it comes back and bounces on a bumper in the back, and it comes back for, you know, because that spring is still driving it, and that sear has to be able to catch it while it's punching forward. So that was a very kind of inelegant system. And the other issue with that system is when you run out of air, well, now you don't have enough gas to knock the thing fully back and get caught by the sear. So you have this brrrr, you know, this sort of machine gun cycling down effect. And that has enormous amounts of problem. I mean, in addition to the fact that it's inelegant and it's ugly and it lets everybody on the field know that you are now at a commission and an easy target, it also causes issues with your paint. Because if you're loading paint, remember, it's not like your paint magically disappears when that happens. That bolt is still cycling, and if you've got paint coming down in there, as that bolt is cycling down very fast now, it's going to be clipping paint, turning your marker into essentially a hose and a blender. On the other hand, if theoretically, you know, they didn't have force feed back in the day, but if you did have force feed, it's now feeding paintballs into the barrel, and that bolt is knocking those balls into the barrel, but there's not enough gas in the system to blow them out, and so that you're filling up your barrel. So all kinds of problems. So that's its own issue with blowback. That's a problem. And it interfaces in a very bad way with the propellant, which is CO2. CO2 is a horrible propellant. Now, I know a lot of the guys, you know, Montneal guys will say, hey, the Mega Z, that's great. Okay. The Mega Z is, it has a unique place in paintball history. You know, it used siphon to siphon liquid CO2 into the valve, and it functioned. It was designed to work that way, and it works pretty well. But for most other markers, it's horrible because it is completely temperature sensitive. You know, temperature goes up, pressure goes up. Temperature comes down, pressure goes down. So what that can do is, you know, remember, you've got this system that requires that pressure in order to function properly. Well, if your pressure spikes, it's very hot, you know, you get sun on a bottle or whatever, now you're running the risk of hot shots. You know, your chronograph readings are going to go up, you're going to shoot hot, you're going to get penalties and be unsafe generally. On the other hand, if the pressure comes down, now you don't have enough to cycle the marker properly, and so you get that, you know, cycling down effect. So what AGD said was, let's just completely throw everything on its ear, and on the, you know, the blowback system, let's flip that model and make it a blow forward. So now we have a spring that drives the thing back all the time. You know, you're not relying on gas to push the system back into the recocked position. It's just a spring. So the only thing that gas ever has to do is to blow paint out. It will blow the bolt forward, and the bolt pushes the ball, and it shoots the paint out. That's the only thing the air ever has to do. The spring is always responsible for returning the system into its ready phase. That's very elegant fix, and what that does is it causes the system to be able to be equally, if not more robust, using smaller and lighter and fewer parts. You know, with a spring holding everything back, now your sear doesn't have to be this huge monstrosity. I mean, if you look at, you know, the VM68, for example, that thing had a 9-ounce hammer. 9 ounces. That is a bludgeoning weapon. You could literally beat a Tyrannosaur to death with those VM68s. Absurd. And the sear that was required to hold that was just this, I mean, it looks like something out of a machine shop. Just ridiculous. And even the Tippmann 98s, you know, which are, you know, miniature by comparison, are still heavy. The Automag sear is this thin little piece of metal. It doesn't have to be huge in order to do its job, and do it very robustly, very reliably. That spring is holding that bolt back. The sear just holds the spring, you know, or holds the bolt rather, like a cork in a bottle. Pull the trigger, and the trigger can be very light. It doesn't have much work to do, because again, that spring is doing most of the work in the system, and that you can have a very light trigger pull, sear drops, and it's like a cork out of a bottle. There goes your air, propellant, your ball goes out, and everything, and the system just resets. So you can have a very stout system without relying on a lot of metal mass and a lot of parts to get the job done. Very elegant. On the flip side of that, with respect to the propellant, they just said, let's put a regulator in it. So if the pressure is very high, you regulate it down. If the pressure is very, very low, you make the system simply operate below the threshold, the bottom threshold. So even if it's super duper cold, your marker's still going to function. So just a very simple, elegant way of doing it. Basically, the philosophy was, how can we reliably fire a paintball using the minimum number of maximally quality parts possible? And that was essentially their way of thinking about it. So you've got to be very impressed with that kind of thinking, that kind of engineering that went into this. So that's a little bit of the backstory. In the next episode, we will talk about some of the specific features and innovations that went into this. So hope you enjoyed it, and hope you check out the next video.